First presenter is Fabian. He talks about knowledge transfer. The title is From Bubble to Pixels, Diving into Underwater Photography. So please start.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm already saying sorry in advance because this is going to be definitely longer than 15 minutes, so there won't be much time for questions. But I just was curious how to approach this because I was asked how to teach you how to edit underwater photographs. But I think the first step for editing underwater photographs is actually taking nice photos in the first place that you can then edit. Because if you take crappy pictures, you can edit them as much as you want. There will never be like a nice picture coming out of it. So the first step is actually to go into underwater photography and to teach you or talk about some of the basics that we have there. So basically, photography, the word comes from drawing with light. It's Greek for drawing with light. And I think this is one important part that you have to keep in your mind, what we are actually doing when we are taking a photo. Basically, we're taking the light from a scene that we would like to capture. And there's three terms that you have to take into consideration when you do photography. It's aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. And it's like a little triangle. So as soon as you change one of those three things in your camera, you have to change at least one other thing. I like it. So you have to at least adjust one other of those two other things if you change one of those. And they all come together to actually make the right exposure to take a nice picture. But I guess most of you might be not familiar with all of the terms, so we go through them quickly. So the aperture is basically how open your little diaphragm here is. So this is called a diaphragm. It works similar to the iris in your eye, and it controls depth of the field by controlling how much light actually enters your camera. And the rule of thumb is a smaller f number. So basically, it's the amount of how much this diaphragm is open. It's directly related to how shallow or wide your focus range is. So with like relatively small f numbers, your diaphragm is quite open and it's actually quite shallow focus range. So right here we see in the nudie branch, only the rhinophores are really crisp and sharp. And then with higher f numbers, like something like f11, f22, depending on the lens on the camera, it can even go higher or not as high. Less light enters the camera and we get deeper focus range. So in the comparison now you see between the two pictures and the different f numbers here, that actually almost the complete nudie branch is completely in focus. Another thing is the shutter speed. So basically this is like a digital camera. It has a digital sensor here, but in old analog cameras, you see it as like the film that is inside the camera. So the shutter speed controls how long light is hitting the film or the sensor of the camera. So basically, if you have relatively short exposure times, less light enters the sensor or the film, but it's really good for like freezing an object. So basically here I tried to photograph a little toy car I had running on my desk with relative short shutter speed. So it's actually quite okay in focus. And if you see here one with more longer exposure times, basically means more light enters the camera, but it also is prone to motion blindness. So if you compare the two pictures, you can already see that this toy car gets now a little bit more blurry with this longer shutter time. And the third one is ISO. So basically it comes from how light sensitive is your film or the sensor of your digital camera. And usually if you have relatively low numbers, your pictures turn out to be quite crisp, but it's also quite light hungry. So you can only use it if there's a lot of light available to get those really nice crisp pictures. You can put, so for example, here this little jellyfish I photographed. Like my desk has a really high biodiversity, as you can see. So if we zoom into here, we see, even if we zoom in, we see the details are kept. It's actually quite nice and crisp. And then if we go higher with our ISO numbers, it's actually get brighter images. So it's good to use during like really dark environments, but it also introduces more noise. And what's meant with noise is that in comparison, this small delay to get way more grainy and less detailed. So these are the three things you always have to take into consideration when taking any picture, doesn't matter above water or underwater. So underwater has actually more challenges for us because, as you probably know and had in your diving courses, is that actually deeper we go in the water, the more of the colors we lose during our dive. So the deeper we go during the diving, usually in the open ocean, everything seems to be getting more blue. So it's like the reds and the yellows that we lose. The first going down, it gets more green, and at the end only blue persists. And if you have more turbid waters, like in coastal areas, actually it tends to be a little bit more greenish, yellowish, depending on the next point that I want to make. But, of course, we go with white balance. So basically, now we have the problem that the deeper down we go while diving, the bluer or greener our environment gets. And we see that in the pictures. So one of the first things we want to do while editing our underwater pictures is actually so-called white balance. And white balance just means that we want to have stuff that we know is white also appears white in our pictures. So if you have here the diver underwater, you see white blue water, but the reef already looks a little bit like also greenish bluish. Also, you can tell by the diver, it all has like a greenish bluish hint. So with our white balance, we want to restore a little bit more natural colors back into our pictures. And this is now basically just going from the picture to do the white balance. And then afterwards, we can start with our editing and bringing back like contrast highlights to get a really nice underwater picture. Yeah. Another thing to look into for diving is also the importance of artificial light. It's just helpful to get the settings nice. So here you see a picture I tried to take of fishes underwater. So basically one time with minimal light, and here I use the flash underwater, and we can already see without really doing much editing, like the fish on the right side has way more natural colors than the picture on the left. And you see, I put in here like all the details I put into my camera while diving to get through this picture. And there's the same for both of picture. Just the difference is for the one picture I used the artificial flash underwater. Another thing is turbidity. So the picture I already took of me while diving Tangam here the other day, and yeah, the conditions were suboptimal for diving. So for wide angle photography, probably wouldn't have been as good as for macro photography. And it's challenging for using the artificial lights now. And for example, on this picture, like it's on the other day for Nakagusku Bay, we had quite a lot of sediments in the water. And for the first picture, you see there's a lot of particles visible in the water. That's because I had the flash too frontal. So the flashes were photographing like frontal to the object. And the second picture looks already way better, despite having the same amount of sediment in the water, because I adjusted the flashes way further to the side. So the particles get illuminated from the side and not so much from the front. So these are all things that you need to keep in mind while already taking the underwater photographs. Oops. So another thing to have in mind, I usually photograph in the raw data file. You usually probably know from your TG something like a JPEG, but the RAW has several advantages in comparison to a JPEG because the RAW file contains unprocessed sensor data. So it's a little bit like an undeveloped film, like a negative of your photograph. And it's really cool because all the light and color information are still captured at the moment of exposure. So we don't lose any data, like the JPEG already compresses our data. So we lose information. And we can work way better on those raw data files to actually bring back reds, contrasts, highlights, and shadows. And also all our edits that we are doing actually non-destructive because we can revisit the file and do edits again and again and again if we at some point want to do a little bit different style of editing afterwards. But there's also a few downsides to photographing in RAW because it's unprocessed data. It's quite large file sizes. So usually if I do just transect pictures where we have like 100 pictures at a time, like the SD card gets full so easily. So it's time when I probably wouldn't photograph in RAW. But if you want to really take nice pictures that you plan to edit later in your software, think about doing RAW, I think the newer TGs, at least, they can definitely photograph in like JPEG plus RAW. So it gives you both options later. And then another downside is that we need to develop the RAW file. So the RAW file, the pictures look not so nice in the beginning. They look quite dull. And we actually need to do something in the software to edit them to make nice pictures out of them. And then also the RAW file is not supported by all systems. If you don't have dedicated software already installed on your phone or on your computer, it's actually that you can't see the file at all. So it's not too nice to share it with other people. I can't just send, here, check out this RAW file, and then you don't have the software on your computer and you actually don't see the picture that I wanted to send you. So now we can look into how we usually would go from like an unprocessed raw picture. Like on the left side is the unprocessed raw picture. We see like the colors, there's quite a lot of blue and green in there. And then the final product I did is on the right side. So I would go now into Lightroom. So this is my Lightroom open now. So usually the first step would be actually to import your pictures. So on the file, you can actually go on the import photos and videos. Then another dialog window would open where you can search for where is the picture on my computer or where is the full folder on my computer. I will leave this out now because of time restraints. So this is then how it looks inside of my Lightroom. You see we are now at the moment in the library mode. So it just shows all the pictures that I have in my folder. So this is basically a folder that I made for this presentation. There's a lot of pictures in here. Sorry, I think I have to change my view because all of you guys are on my, this is better for me. So we see here all the pictures in my folder. So I can go here. This is the one picture I want to edit. We see here, it's called RARW, which is basically the raw file that my Sony camera does. And then I can say, hey, I want to edit this specific picture. And then I just go on the develop. And then the editing mask comes on. Now what you can already see here, you see these funny waves up here. It's actually a so-called histogram. It shows us how the pixels are distributed in our pictures. So to the left are all really, really dark black pixels. To the right would be the really, really light pixels. And then we see like blue, green, and red colors distributed in our pictures. And we need this to check on our work. So one of the first steps we usually always do is like the white balance. So here we can do it either manually adjust the white balance by tempering with the temperature or tint, but you can also choose first this little pipette here and click on something that is a little bit more neutral. So usually sand is a really good thing to be neutral, or generally like anything that would appear like dark, like grayish, white or grayish that you click on. So it already automatically does something here. And we see both of our little levers here already as far to the right as it could go, but we still see the picture is still a little bit like greenish, even a little bit purplish up here, a little bit greenish up here. So we can actually go further down into the so-called calibration and bring back a little bit more of the reds. It's already a little bit better. And then we can shift all our greens a little bit to be more yellow. And always when I do stuff now, you can already see how the histogram up here changes. I can tell you already, like for usually nice pictures, you want a quite evenly distribution of these little pixels up here. So the next step that we can do is like looking at exposure, contrast, highlight, shadows. So what I mean exposure is just depending on the lightness, it's really called lightness of your picture. So how bright or dark does it appear? So if you go to the right, it just gets brighter. If you go to the left, it gets darker. And you see again how the histogram up in the upper right corner is changing. So I actually think that right now 0 is quite nice because it's quite evenly in the middle. We can play a little bit around with the contrast. I'm usually a bit careful with the contrast because contrast works on all of your pixels. So I will later use another function that is similar but doesn't work on all of the pixels. So I just go a little bit higher. It just makes a little bit more crisp. And then we go on the highlights. If I'm hovering over here, we already see here in the histogram, this part gets selected. And we see it's quite empty here. So I actually want to bring back a little bit of the highlights, shift everything a little bit to the right. And the same goes for the shadows. Hovering over to see now this part here is highlighted, and I want to bring everything a little bit to the left to make those pixels a bit more evenly distributed. And yeah, the projector is not as much on my computer. It already looks definitely a little bit better. Then we can also bring back the whites that are really even further to the right here. The part, the same goes for the blacks, which is the really, really left part. So I also want to bring back a little bit of the whites. Ready? Okay.
More questions now or after?
Oh,
Okay.
sorry. I just go through because of the time constraints. So another point I usually don't play around with too much is texture, because texture just makes the pictures a little bit more grainy or even like looking a little bit washed out. So I don't play around too much with texture usually. What I do is clarity, which is similar to contrast, but in comparison to contrast, which works on all the pixels in my histogram, clarity is the same, but it more works for this midtones in the middle. So it usually looks a little bit more natural if you use that. And then newer versions of Lightrooms also have a really nice function called dehaze, which is really good for underwater pictures because it takes away a little bit of the turbidity that we have sometimes in the underwater pictures and just make the water look clearer. And it's similar to contrast and clarity, but it also doesn't work on all the pixels. But we already see again how the histogram changes a bit and gets more evenly distributed. Then we have vibrance and saturation. Saturation, if you crank it up, all the colors will pop out more. But doing too much on the saturation actually looks again a lot like really unnatural colors. So usually instead of like going for saturation, I go for vibrance. It's again that saturation would work on all the pixels in my picture, while vibrance only works on the specific midtones, and using vibrance usually looks a little bit more natural than just cranking up the saturation. Then you also have this tone curve here. That's also a representation basically of those neutral tones here. And now it looks a little bit different because the one is really white and this one is a little bit more such, but this is basically the white part of the histogram again. And what you often find, what a lot of people do is doing a little bit like an S shape, like going a little bit down in the blacks, going a little bit up in the whites. Like for this picture, I don't need to overdo it. I'll just keep it like a little S curve. So I'm probably out. Then we can go play around with more of the other colors. So we still see there's a lot of blue in our picture. So I want to bring down a little bit the blues, like just work on the saturation here of the blue. So here's the saturation, and I just can work on the blue, bring it a little bit back. And then I see that my colors in my reef here are still quite greenish, yellowish. And I want to bring a little bit more of the red, so I can actually change the greens a little bit more. And the yellows a little bit more reddish. Yeah. I think that's coming along quite good. And then we still see that the blue part here in our histogram is still quite high and quite far to the right where the light parts are. So I can tone it down a little bit with the luminance to get it back. And I think one thing I forgot is also I usually crop pictures. So right now we could use it like this, but because I usually export into Instagram and show my picture on Instagram, Facebook, and Instagram use horizontal pictures, we can crop our picture. I know Instagram uses a 4:5 layout of the pictures. And just can switch here to this layout, press enter, and already have it like this. You can play around with the colors a little bit in here also as well, like global colors, and bring back If you're really, really blue, bring back a little bit of the pink through here. If we overdo it again, you see it looks quite unnatural, but it can help us to get a more natural tone in again. So maybe I'll bring in a little bit more pink here. And then we have the next thing that is the details. So the newer Lightroom's version, they have something like denoise, which is like using AI to sharpen pictures, but you can also do it by hand. So what happens here now? What sharpening? If you go all the way to the left, you see it gets a little bit smoother. Going to the right, actually get a little bit more of this grainy structure, but we also get a little bit more contrast in our picture here. And we can also use the manual noise reduction that we also don't want to overdo. So if you crank it all the way to the right, it gets like super smooth, like a lot of the grainy texture actually gets out, but it also tends to look like unnatural. So we don't want to overdo it at the point. And then at the end, what I usually also do is add a little bit of vignetting. I don't know how to pronounce it in English. Vignette. So actually, we bring back a little bit like the framing here. So if you overdo it, you already see it gets quite dark here. So I don't want to overdo it, but it usually is good to use it a little bit because it helps now the people watching at the picture to focus a little bit more on your central object here, the chart. And then stuff that is optional at the end. If you're quite satisfied with the picture, you can still just work with like local adjustment with like brushes, tools, and different stuff. So for example, here I can use a radial gradient that I just will do on my little shark. So I just want to do adjustments in this little area. I could also use a brush and really color in the shark for just that. But for now, I think this one is okay. And just make the shark a little bit brighter, not overdoing it so you don't actually see my filter. But now we just added a little bit more highlights without making it too unnatural, so that the shark pops a little bit more. And that's basically it for like doing this. And if you do a lot of the same edits from time to time, you actually can save all the adjustments that you do here in your like presets. So I already have here some presets saved that basically make a lot of the adjustments I usually do without the white balance. So this would be another way how to edit that. To bring back the shark makes everything a little bit more grayish. But I would go now for this little bit more natural look. Maybe bring back a little bit more the blues. And then if I'm happy, I basically can just click on export. See, it opens another dialog option. So I can basically choose where it will save now my raw file as a picture. JPEG, for example, I can change the name of the file that I had. And I can also tell him like stuff like how big should the picture be, because my raw file is quite big. The whole picture is basically huge. So I can make it a little bit smaller, at a resolution, tell him like how large the end file should be. And then I can just press export. Blah, blah, blah. And now it complains because one picture with that name is already in my folder because I already did it yesterday, but I just used unique names. So we'll add like a little number to it. And this basically now saved this raw file that I had as JPEG. So if I go back into my folder, I actually still keep both things. I still keep my raw file and I still keep the exported JPEG. So if I later want to go back and do something else, like another editing, I still go back into my picture. I could take everything away, and then we go now. Maybe this time I really want to keep it in this orientation, and then with the presets I use, I go for that, and this time I want to do it that way, and then I can export this picture as a JPEG again, like differently. But so you can do it again and again, and just try out stuff. How you want to do it. This basically like a little introduction into the topic of editing. So for a lot of the macro stuff, that I do, you basically don't need to be that crazy on the white balance because, for example, this picture is also raw file, but I used it already with Flash, so it brought a lot of the natural light, of the natural colors back, so it didn't do as much editing. So this is now then how the final product looked like just popped up the contrast and the colors a little bit more. So going back to the presentation, so basically the workflows that we had is like import and organize your files, crop for good composition, what do you want to show, use the white balance on a neutral reference to bring back natural colors, adjust global light balance, also use clarity and haze to add a little bit punch without overdoing it, further do some color corrections to bring back the reds and yellows, and optional also use local adjustments, just some brushes and gradients to make your individual object in the picture stand out a little bit more. So that will be it for now. I know I could do 2 hours, like a full day, just on editing pictures on different poses, but I hope this was a good small crash course into photo editing. So, thanks.
Thank you so much, Gabi. I know this was a lot of work, and I guess it's kind of lucky that you had to give this presentation. What? Basically, I wanted to ask you, so I also like try to play around with it. By the way, Lightroom, but Fabian uses, you have to pay for it, but if you use it on your phone as an app, it's free, with limited functions, obviously. But sometimes I struggle with like what is natural, because I feel like it's maybe a social media problem, Instagram, that we're just so used to like really oversaturated photos to an unrealistic way that when I try to edit my photos, I always feel like it's not enough, and then it's really hard to stop the color correction to not make it too unrealistic. Do you have any?
I mean, it's also what you like or how you want to do it. Like some people are really like into this look, like where it's blue and it's actually like the object is more gray. Some really like this popping colors. One's tone down the colors. So it's basically a little bit your liking, but one thing that helps like already using like this little pipette and really go for these neutral references, like something in your picture that you know should be more white in color because it gives you a good hint, and then basically adjusting from that. So if I go here again, the color, it will go here all the way to the right, and I can say, oh, now it's a little bit too purplish, so bring back a little bit the green colors here, bring back a little bit the blue colors, and I think, oh, that's actually nice because it's an underwater picture. Why shouldn't it be a little bit blue, right? It doesn't need to be super looking like it was photographed above water, right? But sometimes, for example, the nudie branch, like I don't care to people see that it's underwater. I just want to bring out the colors of the nudie branch, so I make it even more popping, right? And then often, like for the whale or like the whale pictures that we took, we actually tone down on the blues a lot and bring out just the whale, but don't use that much colors because it's just the blue and the gray whale in the middle. So it depends a little bit on what is your object that you photograph and what do you want to do with it. So there's no definite answer. Isha?
Hi, thank you. Have you ever encountered difficulties, for example, when you need to identify something by a color and low visibility? It's like here in the field where you take pictures, but then you analyze the pictures and you need to adjust like this editing to see what is in the picture. I know there are some, for example, in drafting object and drafting on sponges, right? But sometimes they are like a bit far away or blurred. So have you ever got into this situation?
So usually I even put my transect pictures through something and try to do a white balance on the transect pictures. And for the transect, if you have it like on the white side, you usually have like probably a point where you have like a white reference. And that's also why a lot of people for the research work, they bring like color charts underwater when they photograph stuff, right? To actually document exactly this problem that you don't know how to adjust the color. So they already bring their reference with them underwater. That's one way to get away with. But yeah, sometimes with the color corrections, especially if it's like a JPEG, which doesn't give you as much room for this color correction because there's already quite a lot of information lost. Like sometimes you're still not happy about the color correction because it still looks too bluish, purplish, and this is not the correct color, but there's nothing you can do from that point.
Yeah, if you don't have a reference.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So this is a paid software, right? Are there
Yes.
any like free software you would recommend for those getting started?
Yeah, not that I really used. So before I actually used the Lightroom version that fell off the end of a truck. I still have, it just doesn't have one of the newer options, which I like. But the newer options, you can also do like the panoramic pictures. So take picture, and then stitch it back together. But the old version I have still has the normal edit versions, but there's something called raw 3P. I tried to look into that for the course, but then I also noticed it would take me way too much time to actually find out how everything works. It looks similar from the surface, but then actually finding the different functions was a little bit too hard. I just gave up in the shot of the time, but that's basically a free color editing program that has most of the functional stuff that Lightroom has. Another one would be similar to Photoshop is GIMP. So I used that before, and that if you always worked on Adobe and then go into something else, it just needs time adjusting. If you start from scratch learning something, it's not such a big problem. So exactly like I can also recommend GIMP for like single pictures. If you take a lot of pictures, something like organizing in like kind of software, I think Raw 3 could be nice.